Today I'm going to show you the family tree of Japanese emperors. The Japanese monarchy holds the distinction of being the oldest monarchy still in existence today. And since every Japanese emperor has been a member of the same dynasty, that dynasty is also the longest reigning dynasty in world history. It's known as the Yamato dynasty, or simply the Imperial House of Japan. We're going to start about 1350 years ago with Emperor Tenmu, the 40th emperor according to the traditional numbering, and we're going to go all the way down to Naruhito, who is set to become the 126th emperor in April of this year. I'll be using my Asian royal family trees chart, which is available as a poster from my website usefulcharts.com. I'm starting with Tenmu because it was during his reign that the two oldest documents about Japanese history were commissioned, the Kojiki and the Nihongi. Tenmu is also the first Japanese monarch to have the term emperor applied to him during his own lifetime. In Japanese, the term for emperor is Tenno, which literally means heavenly sovereign. All of the previous emperors were actually known by different titles and were only given the title emperor after the Kojiki and Nihongi were written. You see, the purpose of these two documents was to establish the legitimacy of the Yamato dynasty, and this was done by extending the line of emperors back into the very distant past and by mixing a bit of legend with actual history. So according to legend, the first emperor of Japan was Emperor Jimmu in approximately 660 BCE. He was said to be a descendant of the Japanese sun goddess, Amaterasu. The next dozen or so emperors after Jimmu are all thought to be legendary as well. However, emperors 15 through 28 are thought to be a mix of both legend and real history. Based on Chinese accounts, what is likely to have been the case in Japan during this period was that Japan was divided into a bunch of smaller kingdoms, and that one particular kingdom, the one based in Yamato, slowly grew to dominate the rest. The first emperor for which we have historical confirmation is Emperor Kinmei, the 29th emperor. He died about 100 years before Tenmu. But like I said earlier, it's not until the reign of Tenmu that an actual history of Japan was commissioned from within Japan itself. So that's why we're starting with him. Also, I should mention that the reason why Tenmu decided to adopt the title of emperor and to establish an elaborate backstory for his dynasty has a lot to do with what was going on in China at the time. This was the time period when the Tang dynasty had established a golden age in China. So the Japanese emperor wanted to model his power and prestige on that of the Tang emperor. Hence we get an emperor of Japan, just like we get an emperor of China. So with all of that background under our belt, let's start going down through the tree. Tenmu was the younger brother of the previous ruler, Tenji. Tenmu had been the heir to the throne for quite some time, but then Tenji had a son and wanted that son to become the next ruler instead. Tenji and Tenmu discussed this, and Tenmu lied, saying he accepted the decision and then went off to become a monk. But after Tenji died, Tenmu declared war on his nephew and ended up seizing the throne for himself. When Tenmu died, his son, Prince Kusakabe, was to become the next emperor, but Prince Kusakabe died before coronation, so his mother, Jito, became reigning empress instead. During this period of Japanese history, we get a lot of ruling empresses. However, in most cases, the ruling empress was the mother or older sister of a male heir, who simply ruled until which time the male heir was ready to take the throne. Because of this, the male-to-male succession was actually never broken, unlike in many European countries. And this is why Japan is unique, and it has only ever had one royal house. So Jito ruled until her grandson Monmu was old enough to become emperor. But Monmu died young, and therefore his mother Genmei became empress. It was during the reign of Genmei that the capital city was moved to Nara, and therefore the Nara period of Japanese history began. Nara was much more elaborate than the previous capital, and was modeled on the capital city of Tang, China. Genmei actually ended up abdicating before the next male heir became of age, and therefore her daughter Gensho became the next ruler. This is the only time in Japanese history that a ruling empress was followed by another ruling empress. Gensho was followed by her nephew Shomu, the longest reigning emperor of the Nara period. Shomu was a devout Buddhist, Buddhism having been introduced to Japan about 200 years earlier. It was also around this time that the Fujiwara clan started to become powerful by marrying into the imperial family, and I'll be getting back to them in a moment. Shomu was followed by his daughter, who reigned twice, first under the name Koken and then under the name Shotoku. In between her two reigns, a descendant of Tenmu via a different line ruled for a brief period, but this is where Tenmu's male line ends, because after Shotoku, the emperorship passed to a different branch of the family. Emperor Konin was a grandson of Tenji, and unlike most emperors, was elderly when he ascended the throne. He was followed by his son, Kanmu, and it was during the reign of Kanmu that the next period of Japanese history began. That period is called the Heian period, named as such because the capital city was moved to Heiankyo, which is modern-day Kyoto. The Heian period was when classical Japan was at its peak. However, it's also the period in which the power of the emperor started to decline. During this period, the emperor went from being the ultimate ruler to simply being a ceremonial puppet monarch controlled by whichever noble family was the most powerful at the time. And the first such family to wield this power was the Fujiwara clan that I mentioned earlier. Female members of this family married many of the emperors during this period, and male members of the Fujiwara clan ended up dominating all of the major political positions. The most important position they took over was that of regent. Previously, as I noted, Japan would often have a female empress who would rule until a male emperor came of age. But from this point on, a male member of the Fujiwara clan, often a father-in-law of an empress consort, would take this role instead. That's why you don't see any more reigning empresses for quite some time. So 3 of Kanmu's sons followed him as emperor, and then the line continued through Emperor Saga. We get several father-son successions until we get a young emperor named Yosei. In his teens, Yosei started to exhibit some sadistic behaviors, and therefore his Fujiwara regent had him deposed. He was replaced with his father's uncle. Now, I'm not going to go through every emperor in this period because there's simply too many of them, but let me point out a few important things. First, this period in Japan coincided with the decline of the Tang dynasty in China. This resulted in the decline of Chinese influence on Japan and the flowering of cultural traditions that were indigenous to Japan instead. One example of this is the development of the kana scripts, which are still used in Japan today alongside Chinese characters. They were first used during this early Heian period. The chart you see on the left is part of a much larger Writing Systems of the World chart that I sell as a poster, but if you want to download just the Japanese section, I'll put a link in the description where you can get an electronic copy of it for free. Back to the family tree, I should point out Emperor Daigo. He was one of the few emperors during this period to try and minimize the role of the Fujiwara clan and exert direct control instead. He was somewhat successful during his reign, but then after he died, the Fujiwaras came back even stronger, basically becoming hereditary dictators. You'll notice that we get several emperors with names starting with Go. Go means later. So, for example, we have Sanjo and Go Sanjo. Go Sanjo basically meaning the later Sanjo as opposed to the earlier Sanjo. If we were to follow European naming customs, we would call this emperor Sanjo I and this emperor Sanjo II. Now, Go Sanjo is actually important because starting with him, we get another shift in the power balance. Go Sanjo abdicated before he died, which means he stepped down and passed things on to his son. But unlike previous rulers who had abdicated, he continued to wield influence during his so-called retirement. This pattern was copied by other future emperors, and therefore the retired emperor became a position that was able to provide a check on the power of the Fujiwaras. Finally, I should point out that it was during the late Heian period that certain military classes, such as the famous samurai warriors, started to evolve. In addition to the Fujiwaras, there were two other families who had risen to become extremely powerful. Both were made up of samurai warriors. These were the Minamoto clan and the Taira clan. Both of these clans came from the male descendants of previous emperors who were not in the direct line to the throne. So they were basically cadet branches of the Yamato dynasty. Let's go to Emperor Toba to see how the stage was set for the rise of the samurai and the next major period in Japanese history. Toba abdicated, making his son Sutoku emperor. But as retired emperor, he decided that he wanted to make a different son emperor instead. So he forced Sutoku to abdicate and made Konoe emperor. But when Konoe unexpectedly died, certain leaders were divided on who should become emperor next. One powerful member of the Fujiwara clan supported Sutoku and another supported Go-Shirakawa. The Sutoku side was supported by the Minamoto clan, and the Go-Shirakawa side was supported by the Taira clan. The resulting civil war is known as the Hogan Rebellion, and Go-Shirakawa and the Taira ended up the victors. But the rivalry between the two samurai clans intensified, and another war broke out just a few years later called the Heiji Rebellion. Again, the Taira emerged victorious. But then a few decades later, a third and much larger war between the two groups, known as the Genpei War, occurred. In that war, the Minamoto finally triumphed and defeated the Taira for good. The story of the conflict is told in the epic poem The Tale of the Heike, which is sometimes called the Iliad of Japan. So a couple of important things to note. Go-Shirakawa abdicated in 1158, but lived through the reign of the next 5 emperors. During this time, he was the power behind the throne. His death in 1192 marks the beginning of Japan's first shogunate, and the next stage in Japanese history. This stage is the feudal or medieval period, and the first shogunate was called the Kamakura shogunate. In feudal Japan, the emperor was once again just a figurehead, and the real power rested with a military dictator called a shogun. The first shoguns were all members of the Minamoto clan, who had won the Genpei War. They were followed by several Fujiwara shoguns and shoguns from several other noble houses. Again, I'm not going to go through every emperor during this period, but let me point out a few things. You can see here that after the reign of Go-Saga, the imperial family split into two branches, and the title of emperor went back and forth between the two sides a couple of times. Both the emperor and the shogun had become figureheads by this point, and a new family, the Hojo clan, was the dominant force. It was during their leadership that the Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, tried invading Japan. In the end, that invasion was unsuccessful, and Japan emerged victorious. Eventually, the split in the imperial family became permanent during the reign of Emperor Go-Daigo. Go-Daigo initiated the Tenmu restoration, which was an attempt to get rid of the shoguns and give back real power to the emperor. The restoration only lasted 3 years, though, and afterwards the imperial court was officially split into two. The southern court moved to Yoshino, and the northern court remained in Kyoto. However, the southern emperors retained the official imperial regalia and therefore are considered by historians to have been the legitimate emperors during the split. The division came to an end in 1392 when the southern court submitted to the northern court, and Emperor Go-Komatsu became the sole emperor. By this point, a new shogunate had been established, the Ashikaga shogunate. However, the Ashikaga shoguns were weaker than the previous Kamakura shoguns, and Japan was in a state of almost constant internal warfare during this period. It was during the Ashikaga shogunate, during the reign of Nara, that Europeans came into contact with the Japanese for the first time. The Ashikaga shogunate was replaced by the third and final shogunate during the reign of Emperor Go-Yozei. That shogunate was the Tokugawa shogunate, and it was ruled from the city of Edo, which eventually evolved into what we now know as Tokyo. This period is therefore also referred to as the Edo period. The Edo period was an extremely peaceful time in Japan, and during this time the samurai, who were no longer needed as warriors, ended up evolving into a group of class-based administrators instead. But perhaps the most important thing about the Edo period was that Japan adopted a policy of extreme isolation. Regular citizens were not allowed to leave the country, and foreigners were generally not allowed to enter. At one point, coastal authorities were even given the permission to kill any foreigner who attempted to come ashore. This policy of isolation coincided with the age of European colonization, and therefore it allowed Japan to become one of the very few countries in the world to never be controlled or heavily influenced by a European power. Japan's isolation came to an end in 1853 during the reign of Emperor Komei. In that year, the U.S. Navy arrived in Tokyo Bay with 4 warships and threatened to attack if Japan did not agree to open up trade with the West. At the time, Japan was still pretty much a feudal society and far behind in technology, so they relented and started to regularly trade and communicate with the U.S. and other foreign powers. Around the same time, there were several political groups that wanted to overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate and return power to the emperor. This is exactly what happened soon after the death of Emperor Komei. The next emperor was Emperor Meiji, perhaps the most important emperor in Japanese history. The period that coincided with his reign is known as the Meiji Restoration. The shogunate was abolished, power was officially returned to the emperor, and in just a few short decades, Japan quickly went from being a feudal society to a modern industrialized state with a Western-style military. Now, how much of this was down to Meiji himself is unknown. It's likely that the real orchestrators of the Meiji Restoration were the leaders who had overthrown the shogunate and put themselves in all the prominent positions of power. Near the end of the Meiji period, Japan started to get aggressive militarily. It went to war with China and Russia and ended up taking over Taiwan and Korea. Meiji was followed by his son Taisho, who had a relatively short reign, and then by Taisho's son, known to the West as Hirohito. Hirohito, of course, was the emperor during World War II. In the years just prior to World War II and during the war itself, the Empire of Japan grew to include Manchuria, most of the coast of China, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and many Pacific islands. It was during this period that many atrocities occurred, such as the Nanking Massacre. But we all know how World War II ended. Japan suffered its own major tragedy when the US dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the war to a close. Many Japanese leaders were brought to trial following the war, but Hirohito was permitted to remain the emperor. In fact, he lived until 1989, becoming the longest reigning emperor in Japanese history. He is now known as Emperor Showa. He was followed by his eldest son, Akihito, who at the time of this video is the current emperor. However, he is set to retire in April of this year, 2019, at which time his eldest son, Naruhito, will become emperor. Akihito will therefore become the first retired emperor in Japan in a very long time. Now, up until very recently, there was some doubt about how the monarchy would proceed in the future. Naruhito has only one daughter, Princess Toshi. There was some discussion over whether or not Japan should follow other countries in adopting absolute primogeniture, which means that the eldest child would inherit the throne regardless of whether that child was male or female. But then in 2006, Naruhito's brother Akishino had a son named Hisahito. So as it stands, when Naruhito becomes emperor in April, his brother Akishino will become the crown prince, and his nephew Hisahito will become second in line to the throne. So that was the history of the Japanese monarchy from Emperor Tenmu to Naruhito. This poster also charts the Chinese emperors all the way from the Tang dynasty through the Qing dynasty, as well as the kings of Korea and many other Asian countries such as India, as well as many Middle Eastern countries as well. If you'd like a copy of the chart as a poster, you can head over to my website, usefulcharts.com. Please note that I do not sell an electronic version. However, my channel has several videos that you can watch for free that show other parts of the chart close up while explaining the history of those dynasties. If you're interested in history, genealogy, or monarchies in general, be sure to subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter or Instagram. Thanks for watching.